Kia ora koutou katoa. Thank you everyone for joining today's webinar. I know for many of you, particularly our viewers in Auckland like me, this is a really uncertain time. So thank you so much for joining us. I hope you're all right, and I hope that the session today can be a chance to think about something else and to think a bit about the future and where we're heading, and get a bit beyond the present moment that we're all living through, where of course there's a lot of anxiety and uncertainty. So thank you so much for being here, and we're really glad to have you. My name's Kathy Errington. You've probably seen me before if you've come to some of our previous webinars. I'm the Executive Director of the Helen Clark Foundation. So if you haven't joined one of our webinars before, I'll just very quickly run through how this all works. The first half, I'll ask some scripted questions of our panelists, and then in the second half, I'll take questions from the Q&A. So if you would like to see me ask something to Holly, Graeme or Brad, please pop that in the Q&A. And also I suggest bringing that up even if you don't have any questions, because you can like other people's questions and they'll move to the top of the list and I'll be more likely to ask them. You'll also see along the bottom of your screen, a chat function. Please don't put questions in there because I won't be looking at that. But if you have technical problems, you can put those in there, and my colleague Paul, who's running the back end today, will do his best to help you. So that's questions in the Q&A and technical problems in the chat. Finally, don't worry, this is not a normal Zoom call, so we cannot see or hear you. If you need to make noise or take a phone call, you can do that and you won't cut us off. So without further ado, I'm really pleased to welcome our three speakers today. All the speakers today contributed to the Ngā Mai Welcome Home report that the Helen Clark Foundation and WSP New Zealand released on the 10th of August. That now seems, of course, like a bit of a lifetime ago for those of us in Aotearoa, but the issues raised remain really salient, and it's really great to get the band back together to reflect a bit about what's gone on since. So the first speaker I'd like to introduce is Brad Olsen from Infometrics. Brad is the Principal Economist and Director at Infometrics. He'll be a familiar face to many of you as he is a regular commentator on economic and policy issues in the media. So welcome, Brad, and thank you so much for your time. Graeme Sharman is the Head of Wellington and Government for WSP New Zealand. WSP New Zealand is, of course, a major partner for the Helen Clark Foundation, and they support the position held by Holly, our final speaker today. Holly is our Deputy Director and WSP Fellow. She was the lead author of the Welcome Home report and has led a program of research in partnership with WSP that has addressed various issues connected to urbanism and sustainability. So my colleague Paul will be sharing some links in the chat to our previous reports, and please do check them out. But for today's purposes, we will focus on the most recent report, the Welcome Home one. It asked, how can we better welcome the Kiwi diaspora, and how can we build an economy and society that people want to stay in? Now, one key development that I know we need to address before we get into anything else if we're talking about the diaspora, this has happened since we released that report on the 10th of August. There's been a really quite significant change in the way applications for MIQ work. And there was already a lot of frustration building towards MIQ, but if anything, the new system, the virtual lobby system, has made that worse because you can see how many, sometimes tens of thousands of people are ahead of you in the queue waiting for usually a small number of thousand rooms to come available. So Brad, I know you've been doing some thinking on this issue. As an economist, we've got a situation here where supply cannot meet demand. There is no feasible way to increase the supply of MIQ rooms to the level of demand. But is there any way we could make it a bit fairer? What do you think?
Yeah, look, and I think it's such a challenging issue, and in a sense, the worst part of the virtual lobby is that we now have an idea of what the quantum of people looking for spaces is. Previous to that, not necessarily a better thing to not know, but at least you didn't know that you were, I don't know, 10,000 people behind everyone else. So look, incredibly challenging, and I think it reinforces that as the pandemic continues to roll through, we've got to adjust our response. Now, you're right that we can't massively increase our MIQ capacity. We probably do still need to look at what we are providing with MIQ in terms of the number of rooms. That's only been going down over the last 12 months or so, and so it's becoming harder and harder actually as we've moved forward. But now we have an idea of how many people might be in the pipeline. We know there's over 31,000 people who are trying to get MIQ slots. The first two through the lobby have shown that. Now, I think what we need to understand there is who is in that line. We know the number, but we don't know what they're up to. Are they New Zealanders who are overseas who want to come home? Are they people with visas who want to come into New Zealand? Are they migrant split families? Are they sports teams and others who might be coming down for a summer beach extravaganza? We don't know, and I say that because the challenge now becomes, and one of the big changes I think we could have, we've got such a finite resource of MIQ. Let's use it more efficiently by having a few more queues, if you will, in the MIQ that provides for an access route for New Zealanders, an access route for sports teams, for migrant families, for skilled workers. The government has to make a political choice on who gets in, but at least you would then know that you are, if you are looking for an MIQ room, that you're competing amongst other people of the same sort. So that, if you will, that we're not having to make what we're implicitly doing at the moment, that's making a value call that there is no difference between a New Zealand sports team, between an overseas sports team, a split migrant family in New Zealand are trying to get home, or someone just wanting to come for a visit. It is a free-for-all, and I think we need to have a much more sort of principled position on understanding what that prioritization needs to be. No one's going to like it, but at least we would have a semblance more understanding of who's coming in and what we are prioritizing there.
Yeah, Holly, I know when you were researching the report, the frustration around how hard it is to come home was really palpable, wasn't it?
Yeah, kia ora koutou and kia ora Brad. Yes, it was. And as you say, Kathy, that predated even the situation that we're now in, where I think that frustration is even more visible. But it was already clear that there were many people, living overseas, many New Zealanders living overseas, really wanting to come home, having strong intentions of coming home. And I think one really key thing to tease out, which Brad has mentioned, is a differentiation between those who are planning to return to live and those who are planning to return for other reasons, because at the moment, as you say, treating them all the same kind of obscures the different purposes of that travel, really, and also from a New Zealand home-based perspective, the potential, I guess, benefit that we get from that travel too, and in terms of offsetting the fact that we don't have any migration happening at the moment, having New Zealanders returning to live could be a really useful thing.
Mm-hmm. So stepping back from the immediate kind of crisis and uncertainty we're dealing with at the moment, because of course in time our vaccination rates will get high enough that we can allow more relaxed movements across the border. Holly, can you give us a snapshot of New Zealand's diaspora connections to the world based on the Welcome Home report and some of the other population trends we were looking at?
Sure, and I'll just now share my screen to help me do that. I've got a few slides that I can show while I do that. So yes, as Kathy mentioned, I'm going to share a few slides that illustrate some of these key findings from this report, which was released in August, just before the start of the Delta outbreak. And really, we were looking at our overseas diaspora. So who are they? Can we meet their needs? Can we attract some of them home? And what does our relationship with our diaspora mean for the trends of a post-pandemic future? And so to answer that, we sort of looked at current demographic trends and challenges and made some policy recommendations for how we can better understand and maximise our connections. And I do think, in light of that conversation we've just been having too, it is important to note that we didn't look at MIQ as part of this report. Although I think if we're thinking about what are the issues for the New Zealand diaspora right now, we absolutely have to acknowledge that that is probably the number one issue for New Zealanders living overseas, and the sort of ongoing fairness and accessibility and sustainability of that system. But just in terms of our diaspora, Aotearoa New Zealand has for a very long time had one of the largest per capita diasporas of any OECD country, with around 13% of those who were born here currently living overseas. And that puts us, the numbers fluctuate a little, but it puts us roughly third in the OECD, behind Ireland and Luxembourg. And at the moment, there isn't, we don't have an accurate measure of our total diaspora. There's no government agency that retains responsibility for measuring our diaspora, and of course it's hard to do that. But according to some estimates, there could be as many as 1 million New Zealanders and their children living overseas. So that's really significant in the context of a 5 million population, to have another fifth of that living in other parts of the world. That estimate of 1 million is a bit of an extrapolation, but it's not an unreasonable one. So we know there's roughly 600,000 New Zealanders in Australia alone. And it's also been estimated that's about 75% of New Zealand's total diaspora. So that would put the total at around 800,000. And then those don't include the children of those people. So if we factor in the children, who may also have a strong interest in returning to New Zealand at some point, that's where we get that 1 million figure from. But the fact that we don't have a really accurate measure is an issue that does need to be addressed to make good policy in this area. And I think we need to consider the diaspora alongside what's been happening to the home-based population in recent years. And I know we'll talk a little bit more about this soon. But just briefly, prior to the pandemic, New Zealand had been experiencing a period of very high population growth of approximately 2% per annum. So one of the highest rates of growth in the OECD. And most of that, about 2/3 of that growth was coming from very strong positive net migration. So in this chart, that's the dark grey bars. And about 1/3 of that growth was coming from natural increase, births outnumbering deaths. That's the light grey bars in this. And as you can see, the red bars represent migration of New Zealand citizens. So for at least the last 20 years, that had been in the negative. We were losing New Zealand citizens every year. And in those 2 decades, we really developed this political discourse around the brain drain. It'll be very familiar to people. Politicians on both sides of the spectrum, depending on who was in government, had kind of accused the other of not doing enough to keep people and retain them here. But we've actually never really had a strategic policy for thinking about and managing our overseas diaspora. But as you can see, just actually, interestingly enough, in 2020, just before the pandemic, we had the first net gain of New Zealand citizens. And then clearly in 2021, that international migration fell away completely. And we had a net gain of New Zealand citizens again. So that's really given us a bit of an opportunity to rewrite that story from the brain drain story, both in terms of the numbers coming and going, but also in terms of how we think about it. And so this chart is just adapted from a Stats NZ one, which looks at migration during a year to year from May 2020 to May 2021, chunk of last year. So of course, when we closed our border, obviously arrivals of new migrants completely fell away. And to a large extent, so did migrant arrivals of New Zealand citizens. So from May 2020 to May 2021, there was an 87% drop in migrant arrivals of non-New Zealand citizens and a 40% drop in arrivals of New Zealand citizens. So that's kind of interesting, because I think during a lot of last year, there was a public narrative of New Zealanders returning in droves, this big influx of people coming home because of the pandemic. But actually the figures don't really yet support that narrative. And possibly part of that may well be to do with access to MIQ. But also, just in general, we saw actually half as many New Zealanders return to live in 2020 as would happen in a normal year. But the reason we still had a net gain is that very few obviously were leaving. So overall, the result was a net increase. And we have a Q&A from Distinguished Professor Paul Spoonley from Massey University in our report, where he describes it. Really, we had a brain retention rather than a brain gain. But we do think that small net gain could be indicative of the start of a new trend of New Zealanders returning home to live. And certainly if the intentions of overseas New Zealanders that have been indicated in recent surveys are predictive of future trends, then we probably could expect quite a large number of New Zealanders to return to live in the coming months and years, assuming of course they can access an MIQ slot or whatever that system is going to evolve into in the future. And if and when they do come home, they'll be coming home to a country whose population is growing, diversifying, aging and urbanising. And I think we'll talk a little bit more about the population trends a bit later on in our conversation. But just in particular, I think it's interesting to note the extent to which our population is urbanising, and this chart really starkly shows how much of that growth will take place in Auckland alone. So in terms of how much our population is projected to grow, 3/4 of that growth is expected to take place in cities, and Auckland alone will account for half of it. So the Auckland population is projected to rise from 1.7 million, where it is now, to about 2 million by the next decade. So there's really significant growth implications for Auckland in particular from that projected growth. And I'm sure we'll get into this more, but the Infrastructure Commission has noted that really there are significant pressures being placed on our existing urban infrastructure by this growth, in particular for affordable and abundant housing and for urban environments that promote greater connectivity and mobility with employment and social services and recreation in Auckland in particular. So just a tiny bit about what we know about the New Zealanders who may begin to return home in the coming years. So we know about our diaspora that, as I mentioned before, the majority live in Australia and followed by the UK, US and Canada, so other English-speaking countries. There's, as I said before, 600,000 New Zealanders in Australia alone, and some research suggests as many as 1 in 6 of all Māori now live in Australia, which is really interesting when we think about things like te tiriti rights to citizenship and mana whenua status for someone who's living in another country, particularly at a time when we can't freely move. So there's an interesting sort of dimension to add to our conversation. New Zealanders living overseas are more likely to be highly educated. So, of our home-based population here, around 30% have a tertiary qualification, but that increases to around 40% of those who are living overseas. And in fact, 15% of all New Zealanders who hold a university degree currently live offshore. So this tends to be a very highly educated, highly skilled group. They can really have significant benefits to New Zealand even whilst overseas. So there's good, strong economic research that suggests that having citizens or people with strong ties to a country living overseas can have real benefits for the home country in terms of skills and contacts and experiences that they can transfer home, not only by moving here, but also by investing, mentoring, fostering trade links between countries. So there's a lot that people living offshore can still do to stay connected and benefit New Zealand even from overseas. But if they do come home, they could certainly bring a big boost to the economy and productivity because of that highly skilled and highly educated nature of that group. They have the potential to really boost innovation and productivity in our economy if they come home. But some, of course, will also require support. So not all will be able to immediately start boosting our productivity, but may need to access health and social support when they arrive. And the final thing I say is they really want to come home. So according to Kia, who were an organisation we worked with quite closely in the preparation of this report, who survey expat New Zealanders, according to their 2021 survey, 31% of the people they surveyed were planning to return, and more than half of those were planning to do so in the next 2 years. So that's a significant opportunity. We're probably looking at potentially tens of thousands wanting to return. And so we need to think about how we're going to prepare for that and what we want to do as a country. And of course, there also will always be some who stay overseas, and that also represents an opportunity to start thinking differently about our diaspora, not as a drain, but actually as a potential source of economic, cultural and social exchange and connection. And so very quickly, at the end of our report, we sort of make 3 overarching recommendations, and they are that we need to really invest in understanding and tapping into the potential of our offshore diaspora. And we recommend there that we have a diaspora strategy and even that create a ministerial portfolio or allocate responsibility to a minister for oversight of the diaspora. We recommend rolling out the welcome mat to those who do want to return, thinking about how we do that. I think people who have returned during the pandemic, many have reported quite a bumpy landing and not feeling as welcome or at home as they expected to. And I think there's things we can think about there in terms of how we make people feel welcome. And then finally, that we need to really, especially in light of those urban infrastructure pressures, create world-class cities and towns that are globally competitive and where people will want to live and stay if they return. And so that's things like looking at our housing, our transport, urban sustainability, and ideas of things like low traffic neighbourhoods and 20-minute cities where people can really experience what they in many cases will be used to from international centres where they've been living, and we're not quite up to speed here in New Zealand on that stuff yet. So that's a really quick sort of skate through the report, a snapshot of some of the key findings, and yeah, we can return to some of that stuff if it's interesting during our discussion.
One of the ideas you mentioned, I know, is a particular area of expertise for WSP. So Graeme, I was wondering if you would be able to speak to what is a 20-minute city. And if you look at the Welcome Home report, my colleague Paul has shared a link to it in the chat. You'll see an insert in it from WSP about 20-minute cities.
Yeah, I mean, effectively, the concept of the 20-minute city is to have access to amenities within 20 minutes of the place that you live. So it's about social and community connection to your local areas, and then designing and building communities around that idea of connection, both social and physical. Yeah.
And Brad, how well do you think we're doing at creating cities like that?
I think we're getting better. It's taking a while. I mean, funnily enough, I was thinking of my experience here in Wellington at the moment and how I function. You know, I walk my 20 minutes to work and similar. So I think we've got more of that, but it requires a very different mindset that we're on, like I say, on the right path, but still taking a while. We know we've got housing issues, but we also know that densification means that we can build up, we can build sort of those different community hubs that we've been looking at. We can ensure that people are a lot more connected. Having grown up in, a much more spread out Whangarei, for example, 20-minute city concept is quite foreign. You certainly couldn't access most resources within 20 minutes. And so I think more and more we are moving that way. And it's because we are very much changing the way we're living. So an exciting opportunity and the right path that we're on, but it requires, I think, that continued commitment from decision makers, from the public itself, but also from those who are planning and operating our cities to enable that sort of option.
So one of the things your report, obviously, Holly, went into some depth about is that New Zealand's population is changing. And Graeme, I know it's in the area of interest to you, looking at population data and some of those trends. So I was wondering, could you tell us a bit more about the medium-term population trends New Zealand's facing?
Yeah, so I suppose this is a story of kind of how we got here and then how we then go forward. So if you have a look at, our population growth from, how we got to our first 5 million, I guess. It's been a bit of a slow burn, but it's actually been pretty consistent. New Zealand's population, particularly in the last 50, 60 years, has grown at roughly 1.4 to 1.5% per annum. And it's been pretty consistent. There have been some growth higher than that, and then also some periods that are a little bit lower, but generally we've stayed to that trend. When things kind of changed, we're in kind of the mid-1980s, and our population forecasting changed. The methodology changed, and the forecasts from that point on basically had a range of 0.6 to 0.9%. While our population continued to grow at about 1.4 to 1.5%. So the delta from where we planned to be in the 1990s and where we are now, 35 years odd later, there's about 1 million additional New Zealanders than what we planned for just 3 decades ago. And the result of that today is what we're seeing in terms of the housing crisis and the infrastructure deficit. So the medium-term trend is that as of last year, Stats released their latest forecast. Their forecast had, again, a continuation of that trend of 0.6 to 0.9%, with New Zealand's population plateauing at around about 6.8 million New Zealanders at about 50 years in the future. If we continue to grow at the rate that we have in the last 50 odd years, our population in 50 years' time will actually be more like 14 million New Zealanders. So that's quite a significant, that's a 7 million population delta between where we are currently forecasting and where we could end up feasibly if we just continued our population trend over the last 50 odd years. That's not taking into account the last decade, where, as Holly said earlier, our population has actually grown at over 2%. So if that was to continue, we would actually hit a population of more than 20 million New Zealanders in 50 years' time. Now, granted, there are a whole lot of other factors. We do have an aging population. How many of New Zealand's diaspora actually do return home? All sorts of other factors. One of the key things, which I think we need to kind of put a bit more thought into, is actually how much of an impact is climate change going to have on the demand of immigrants wanting to move to New Zealand to effectively flee climate change consequences around the globe. So yeah, it's really interesting. And the consequences are actually quite large. If we're only planning for a population of 7 million and we end up with 14, well, all of a sudden our infrastructure is just not going to cope. The housing crisis, we're never going to be able to fix it. The infrastructure deficit, we'll never get on top of it because we're not planning for that level of New Zealanders in the future.
Brad, would you have anything to add to that?
Oh, I think, I mean, all of this is connected, and I think Graeme makes the very important point there that, you know, this sort of thing, that the issues build up over time. They are not a point in time, they are cumulative, and we're already starting to see some of those issues. I'm glad you brought up climate change, but the other one that gets me is, look, because we've sort of undercooked our population estimates over previous times, we haven't planned properly for our population heading forward. Because of that, we've got the housing crisis at the moment. Because of that, young people are having to get into a lot more debt. Therefore, we're having young people are getting into relationships. We're having children later in life. That's pushing the demographics again even further. We know that the aging population is going to be a big shift. Back in the 1990s, we had, I think, around about 6 working age people to every retiree. So, you know, retirement savings was something we could afford a lot more. And I think the 2050s, we're talking about 2.2 working age people to support every retiree. There will be 1 million more retirees over the next 30 years. There'll only be an extra 500,000 people in the working age population. So again, all of these mixes really do compound over time, and it suggests that we've got to do something more than nothing, which is our current sort of focus when it comes to resourcing population growth, when it comes to understanding what these demographic shifts are, because we're having different components of families, we're having different ethnic groups rising across New Zealand. All of that's critical to understanding where we head to next. Otherwise, we'll do exactly what we've done over the last 40 years, and that's sort of sleepwalk into the current position where we talk more about deficits than we do anything else.
Yeah, Holly, did you have anything further?
Yeah, I guess I think both Graeme and Brad have covered that really comprehensively. I guess the question that leaves then from a policy perspective is, you know, so there's 2 issues really, I suppose. There's getting accurate forecasting of our future population sorted, and that is, you know, that is notoriously difficult to do. But as Graeme said, I guess we do have some good historical data to suggest we've been under projecting it. So, you know, what assumptions could we build into our modelling to correct that? Acknowledging, of course, that we're in a very strange moment for that right now, with so much uncertainty about the pandemic and when our borders reopen, and when they do, you know, will, for example, that high demand for migration to New Zealand from non-citizens continue? Will that still be there as it was before? Will it be more? Will it be less? We just kind of don't know some of those things. So it is quite a hard place to project from right now, but we do need to think about that. And then I think taking even a step further back from that is to think, well, from a policy perspective, you know, there is a case, I think, to be made for having a goal in mind, you know, whether as Graeme said, we could be facing this a high growth scenario where we get up to 20 million people. A low growth scenario could be around 6 or 7 million. You know, what do we actually want as a country, and where would we like that population to plateau and to hit a sustainable level? And then if we're able to have that mature conversation, we can then make policy accordingly to help us to get to that place where we want to go. But I think it's a really difficult and politically fraught area, because as soon as you start to talk about population policy, I think a lot of people's hackles rise. You know, on the one hand, if you're talking about limiting, about trying to keep a low growth scenario, you end up talking about limiting migration. You end up in conversations around xenophobia, and we've seen actually quite a lot of that in Aotearoa in recent years. We know what that conversation feels like. It's not always great. Or you could be talking about things like limiting fertility or sort of encouraging different fertility choices, or on the other hand, as Brad was saying, sort of trying to encourage greater fertility, which, from a feminist perspective is pretty challenging to do policy-wise and not necessarily desirable. So I understand why our politicians have stayed well away from this area in the past, but I think the net result has been we have quite a laissez-faire approach to this, which does, of course, have huge implications, not only on our infrastructure, but on all other aspects of our economic and social policy. So it's a curly one to get our heads around, but I think it's probably worth having some of that conversation.
So I'll just jump in now to remind you all to please, if you have questions for the panel or there are areas you would like them to go back to or address in more depth, please put those in the Q&A. We've got 2 questions in there at the moment. It'd be great to have a few more. But picking up on what you said, Holly, about the idea of population policy and the idea that we might set a goal, like you said, you kind of take a deep breath at the idea of venturing into that space. But Graeme, I know you have done a lot of thinking about that idea, and that the potential of setting a goal like that, something 10 million is something you've talked about. Can you expand a bit on the idea and why you think population policy is the right choice for Aotearoa?
Yeah, I mean, I don't necessarily think that it's about the policy. I think it's about having adequate forecasting and then being able to use that data to inform planning decisions, I think. So rather than it being a population plan or a population policy, it's actually about being able to plan based on data. It needs to be a data-driven decision. And I think, like the example of the last 35 years where we've actually been quite wrong. New Zealand seemed to do a pretty good job at forecasting our population up until about the mid 1970s. And then at that time, there was this national narrative that we had overbuilt our infrastructure as a country, and that we had started to build sort of white elephant projects that no one would need or want. So the brakes of investment went on, and our forecasting of population growth went down. And then we ended up in a situation now where 35 years later, we have the housing crisis and infrastructure deficit. So it's all about the data. It's all about the input that you can then use to make your plan. So, regardless of where the number, and that's, the number of population ends up being a political decision, in terms of like WFP's perspective, where we would need to plan and build our national infrastructure, we just need good data to base that on. And the example that I'll use is when we're doing investment assessments and business cases for infrastructure projects. We typically have a 50 to 80 year kind of time frame that we look at, and we try and build that capacity and justify the investment based on the capacity that's required. If the input data, so the population forecast, is too low, considering that it takes 20 years for an infrastructure project to go from ideation to then being, planned, funded, and delivered, if the population forecasts are wrong, if the data inputs are wrong, we may only get a decade worth of capacity out of that infrastructure rather than 50 years or 60 years of capacity out of that infrastructure. So that's how that impacts it on the ground on a case-by-case basis. And then because of that, infrastructure investment gets harder and harder to justify because the business cases don't stack up because the data you're putting into it is wrong. So effectively, yeah. So back to your point, it's not necessarily about having the population target or strategy or even a policy. It's actually about getting the forecasting right, and then the forecasting informing the decision that you can then plan against. Yeah.
We've had a question come in from the audience that I think is quite relevant to what you were just saying. Carol Beaumont asks that she agrees with what you said, Holly, about the difficulties of creating population policy. And she asked, are there any examples from overseas where countries have pursued this and it's gone well or otherwise? So just direct that firstly to Holly and then really move around the panel. I'm interested if there are cases like that.
The one that we cited in the report, and when we just sort of dipped our toe into this discussion in a little sidebar in the report, is that Australia has quite a new population strategy along these lines. I don't know that I would yet be in a position to cite it as a successful one because it's only about 2 years old, but they certainly are trying to do exactly what we're talking about here, sort of project accurately and think about what would be a sort of sustainable level of growth that they want to see as a country. yeah, I'd say the jury's probably out in terms of the success of that. But I know that Graeme also has some experience of working in contexts where this sort of planning is done, so he's might be in a good position to answer that.
Yeah, absolutely. So so with the Australian example, so their population plan, their current population plan was released in 2017, but in the early 2000s they had a national population target, and it was I think from memory it was about 42 million national population, and then they went as far as to map out where that population would be located, primarily along the eastern seaboard of the Australian coast. But they then used that target to then inform infrastructure investment, and then also to allocate funding to states which would have, and I know the example that I'm most familiar with is Southeast Queensland, where funding was then allocated towards like highway investments between Brisbane and the Gold Coast and the Sunshine Coast, for example. So yeah, that it was sort of a bit of a more sort of rudimentary kind of target than what they've got now in their 2017 population plan. But even then, we can see how it then allowed funding to move towards investing in infrastructure where they foresaw future population growth.
So Brad, what do you think about the idea of population policy or drawing on examples overseas?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, and I think Graeme made the point quite well there, where it might not be a fully written up policy, if you will, that has to be quite as definitive, but we've got to do something more than our current approach, which is wing it. And I know that's a New Zealand thing, and gosh, I do like it a lot of the time, but it hasn't really served us well. You know, you look at our water infrastructure, for example, across the country, we haven't put enough money aside to enable it to keep going, and that's because we haven't known exactly what's coming down the tracks or the pipes, as the phrase might be. All of this also suggests that, we do need to have a lot better information about what we are doing, but we also, I don't think, want to swing the pendulum too hard from absolutely no planning to sort of hardcore town planning of the 50s. I think there were certainly some issues back then as well. But put it this way, we only, for the first time last year, understood internal migration across New Zealand. We had no idea, apart from a 5-yearly census snapshot, how many New Zealanders already within New Zealand moved from one town to another. So it's taken us a while to start getting some really useful information. I think we're in the position now where we've not only got to have that information, but we've got to use it. Because one of the other challenges we often have is that, we'll have these issues, or we'll know a little bit about the population. Do we use that to actually fund our infrastructure? Do we use it to understand what sort of skills we don't, or need to have in New Zealand? All of those components come off having good population information. So there's very much a need to have a much more nuanced approach to using this sort of information, because it does have huge implications. We look at the moment with New Zealand's issues around skilled talent and similar. That's something that, if we'd realised it early enough, we would have been able to provide more support to get people into those skilled areas. We would have provided greater incentives, or at least a strong signal to overseas Kiwis that there are opportunities coming forward here in New Zealand. And again, we might not have been in the position where I need to have $300,000 or so to buy a house in Wellington. All of that sounds like a pretty good option if we can try and correct it into the future.
So just before I start, from now on, I'll be drawing largely from the Q&A for my questions, but I just had one last thing I'd like to see Holly expand on, because I know in your previous career in politics, you were part of an attempt to try and venture into this space. So a bit more proactive population policy was something you were part of discussions about. And can you tell us a bit, how does that go when you try and do this in practice?
Yeah, so for those who don't know, I was a Green MP from 2011 to 2014. And, I'd characterize what you're talking about there as a sort of quite low-key conversation within the party at that time, the Green Party at that time, to develop some proactive population policy, particularly with a view to thinking about climate change, both in terms of, what's sustainable at a planetary level in terms of human population and impact on the climate, and then in New Zealand, sort of what's the principled approach to take here, considering issues as we mentioned before around like climate migration and so on. And for many of those reasons I mentioned before, we weren't able to advance that. Basically, the Green Party in particular operates on a consensus-based decision-making model, where consensus needs to be reached by those who are part of the conversation to move a policy forward. And I think illustrating exactly some of the issues that I talked before, sort of feminist takes on population policy and when it relates to fertility, and very strong feelings in both directions around migration policy in terms of infrastructure, but also in terms of xenophobia and welcoming of diversity. There was no consensus able to be reached at that time. I'm not sure what, if anything, has happened subsequently. I'm not so active in the party these days, but yeah, it's certainly illustrative of the fact that these are really challenging issues to develop a consensus around.
So from our top question that I think would be great to see you guys speak to is, do panelists think we will see brain drain 2.0 based on the gap between wages and house prices in New Zealand? So I'll kick that one initially to Brad as our resident economist, and then I'll kick it to our other speakers.
I think we've got to be realistic that there is quite a risk there, and I think actually, I mean, Holly, we talked about that as well in the report, sorry, you talked about that in the report in terms of the challenges not only around sort of wages and house prices and similar, it's also how we treat New Zealanders. So if there is an option, a better option overseas, there is a huge risk. We also know that those sort of recently returned are probably the most likely to head off as well. Research that MB did of people who were going through MIQ between August last year and January this year found that 24% of them said, look, if COVID conditions get better across the world, I'm out of here again. So that's a quarter of people who have come back of 170 odd thousand who have gone through MIQ that are at risk. I think we've also got to be realistic that the wages and the house prices do make it difficult because we know that, some industries are much better paid in Australia. We know that, living costs in some respects are better. Where I see the key areas, if you will, in terms of that possible brain drain are very much around the likes of construction. Australia has a $100 billion CapEx infrastructure plan that they're going through. That's a lot of work to get done, and nursing and healthcare as well, because we know the differences with that. I guess so the question that isn't asked there, but I think we need to answer is, what are we going to do about it? If we lose a huge amount of our population, if we have this brain drain, that could be a massive hit to our economy. It could certainly slow us down. And I think that's where we also started to hear a lot more in the report that Holly has written around that need to understand and really support New Zealanders as they start to come back to New Zealand and enable, we've got to create a picture and a reason that people want to stay here. It's not just because New Zealand is great and clean and green and has some fantastic beaches. We have that, we're sold on that. We need to enable people to have that strong experience in business, to feel like they're valued, to have that real connection back here to Aotearoa. That's going to make sure that if we do have a brain drain, it is kept as small as possible.
Holly or Graeme, anything to add?
No, thank you, Brad. I was going to cite that same statistic. So yeah, it's an indication of both the opportunity and the risk here, I guess, that of those who have recently returned, around a quarter are just kind of biding their time potentially and waiting to see, and they could well leave again. So that presents a real opportunity to make sure that doesn't happen, but likewise is a significant risk. And from that same survey that Brad was mentioning, which is the MB survey of returnees, the top 5 occupations that the people had last worked in overseas were things that we really, really do need here. So registered nurses, chief executives and managing directors, software and applications programmers, GPs and resident medical officers. These are people be really great to retain if we can. And there are a number of different factors, I think, that it's a shame in a way we don't have a recently returned person on the panel with us today to talk about this, but I think anecdotally from people I've spoken to and from the panel that Brad and I were on a few months ago, where we had some recently returned people on the panel, there are real elements of I guess kind of shock, both culture shock and kind of, I suppose, economic shock really, that people do experience when they return from overseas. So one is around a sort of a tall poppy syndrome factor. So very often, especially people who are operating at quite high levels in their international jobs will find that their skills and experience are not really understood or valued when they come home, even though they may have been operating, in extremely complex and high performing environments. they encounter a certain degree of like, oh, well, that's fine, love, but, you know, we do it differently here when they come home. And so as a result, some very strange outcomes where extremely well-qualified people have not been able to find employment when they return. Another factor, of course, is around cost of living and housing in particular. So, you know, many people I've spoken to just kind of could not believe how bad the housing situation had become while they've been away, how expensive the basic cost of living was, and also how much time they ended up spending in their cars, having been used to living in places where both public and active transport were more accessible. So yeah, the things that bring people home, you know, the thing is, from Kia's surveys, we know people are realistic. They know they are not likely to earn as much in New Zealand as they could overseas, but other factors are bringing them home. Some of it's that lifestyle thing, it's environmental, and a lot of it is about being closer to family, especially at such a sort of challenging and uncertain time. So there are other more sort of heart-based reasons that people want to come to New Zealand, and they are prepared to make some trade-offs in terms of their income and their career. But if it's so unaffordable and so difficult to access adequate housing, or they can't actually find a job, even if they are prepared to take some trade-offs, then they will leave again. And so in particular, I think the housing issue is one that we really need to address urgently, as everybody knows, for this as well as for a myriad of other reasons.
So we've got another popular question here that it would be good to see addressed. Do we need to think about incentivizing population growth in the regions rather than our existing urban areas? Is that a worthwhile effort? And if so, is there any policies that can work? And I know, Brad, you did some work on this specific question as part of the preparation for the report. So if you can take it first, and then I'll go to Graeme.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll be interested in Graeme's perspective as well, particularly around that 20-minute city sort of element, because it is sort of a growing option. I think COVID has enabled us to think a little bit more about that in a way that we never have before, because we have been seeing more people think about the regions, move there. Not only are there job opportunities there in the primary sector and similar, where we haven't got as many jobs coming through our urban centres, but people are also realising, particularly now that you can work from home for a lot of different options, that, well, why would you sit in traffic every day? Why would you, spend megabucks on a house when you could have possibly a much more comfortable, much more affordable, much more fun lifestyle for your family, yourself, still access your job. So I think we are going to see much more of that coming forward. But I also suspect one of the big changes, one of the big options that are there is that we've done a lot with our tourism sector over the last decade or so of having sort of destination plans. How do you market your local region, your local area to get people in? How do you showcase the local beaches, the best cafes and similar? That's great. How do we do that for businesses and workers as well? So you're not just marketing the cool recreation, fly in, fly out tourism options. It's, look, this is a great place because we've got good internet, there's a strong community sense, we've got some great schools, there's an ability to base yourself and your workers and really establish something good where you're not having to pay the same amount of overheads and similar. So I think there are some big opportunities. Again, we're trending in the right direction, but it is going to take a concerted effort and comes back to that point around, our current stance around population. We've sort of got to move away from winging it quite so much into a little bit more of a deliberate focus when it comes to providing a bit more support to move people into the regions.
What do you think, Graeme?
Yeah, Brad pretty much said everything I was going to say, but the point I was going to add is, we can't, at the moment, it's sort of along that line of we're just winging it. We can't just rely on Auckland to keep absorbing the majority of our immigration and population growth, nor can we just export that to the regions without there being a plan around how many New Zealanders are we going to have in the future, and then plan around where those New Zealanders are going to live. Where do we invest for the infrastructure? Because if all we do is export the our urban population to the regions are going to suffer from an infrastructure deficit as well. They're going to suffer from a housing shortage as well, and the prices there are also going to go up. Extreme scenario, you could end up with a regional town having house prices similar to Auckland. That's not going to help our country in any way, shape, or form. So it comes back to having that plan.
And can I just comment? I mean, we are risking doing that almost already. Let's look at Gisborne Tairawhiti. I mean, there's not a rental to be found there. When I was last in the region, there wasn't even a motel available because of how many people were having to be hosted in emergency housing. Similar sorts of issues in Rotorua and parts of Taranaki. So you're absolutely right, Graeme. We've got to sort of plan for it. And again, I guess the risk that we sort of have at the moment is that we've got to plan for it, but we've also sort of got to build the plane while we're flying it, because the issue is occurring just as much now as it will in the future. So a big need for us to really quite quickly get onto this rather than sort of navel gazing for too much longer either.
One thing that came up during when we put the report out for peer review is there's a line of argument that says incentivizing people to move to the regions is pointless. You know, immigration schemes, if you look overseas, that have tied immigrants to have to live in a regional area for a certain number of years. In practice, they stay there for the set amount of time and then they leave and move to the urban centres as soon as they're allowed. What do you think about that, Brad?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting. It is an interesting challenge in terms of how you move people there, and we've done similar sorts of things on a much more temporary scale in New Zealand that have fallen flat too. People will remember when MSD tried to pay beneficiaries to move to, say, Hawke's Bay or the Bay of Plenty to pick fruit, and there wasn't a huge amount of uptake. But that's again, I think that's something that came through in the report is sometimes the I think Holly talked about sort of the heart connections that are coming forward. That's a big one. You know, if you take say a beneficiary in Wellington, for example. Why would they want to uproot their lives, you know, and move away from their family for a few weeks to earn some money? That sort of social connection, the cultural connection as well that people have is quite important. And again, comes back to this need to understand some of those factors. You know, it's not as cold-hearted as just some numbers on a spreadsheet. Better numbers on a spreadsheet are important, but understanding those motivations become critical as well. And again, that's what we started to hear from New Zealanders who are coming back home or wanting to come back home. They were very much interested in trying to move to where their family might have been, particularly you know, at the start, and then when opportunities arise they might well think about moving forward. But the challenge at the moment, I think, is very much around giving people a reason to come in, giving them sort of the imperative to move to a place and feel that they can stay. Incentives that are sort of too cold and hard, if you will, in terms of, you know, cash incentives or anything else, like you say, they are limited in term. If you make people put down roots, if you give them the option to really dig into the community there, that's going to be way more long-term than anything else.
So we don't have too much longer, so I'm sorry we won't get through everybody's questions, but I think there's a great one here in from David Hawke asking what do projections around changes to inequality fit in with the projections for population growth? What is the relationship between those two things? Graeme, if you could take this one to start with, and then I'll go to the other speakers.
Yeah, I guess I'm probably not the best one to kind of answer this one. I guess, you know, in terms of the report, we know the mega trends within it in terms of our population, you know, aging, diversifying, etc. But in terms of how that leads to inequality, I suppose I'm best to pass that over to either Holly or Brad. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm interested also to hear what Brad has to say. I guess my first response to that question is, as Graeme said, one of the things we know about our population is that whilst it is ageing across all ethnic groups, it is becoming significantly more ethnically diverse. And so in the next 30 years or so, we'll see a very, you know, the cohort of children and young people in 30 years will be much more ethnically diverse than currently, which I think is a great thing, and it's an exciting thing, and it's a thing that will, really characterize the future of Aotearoa as a sort of Pacific nation. But unfortunately, currently, we have really entrenched economic inequalities that correspond closely to ethnic disparities. And we can see it right now in terms of the rollout of the COVID-19 vaccination program. You know, it's sort of, as so often happens when we're considering major social and economic policy, the benefits tend to be distributed to those who already have the most resources and be felt least by those who have the least resources. And so in the context of, I think, planning our population, given we know that diversification is going to occur, we do risk seeing a sort of hardening or entrenching of those inequalities and greater stratification, which I think would be extremely unfortunate. And so therefore that needs to be a really present priority in terms of our decision-making matrix that we're using when we're choosing our policies in this area and others, to try to reverse that effect and to really plan to turn it around, to avoid some of that, those challenges that, again, if we keep doing it the way we're doing it, we will, I think, see those inequalities worsen.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll keep this brief because I see that we're very close to time. Theoretically, an increase in immigration and similar should actually provide us better economic outcomes over time. It should, in a sense, reduce inequality, but that's theory. And the challenge that we have is that the reason it hasn't been doing that is, again, because we haven't been doing that planning quite as well. It means we have migrants that might be coming over into New Zealand not being as efficient because they're not accepted into the sort of to bring their ideas from overseas. We might have migrants that come over with skills that we don't recognise, and therefore we sort of have highly skilled people that are doing low or low wage jobs and similar. But we might also have New Zealanders that we're not equipping with the right skills as we move forward because we've never had any real structure around our population shifts into the future. So theoretically, we should have more people, which drives more demand, and we can resource growth and have agglomeration benefits and similar. That's the theory. But at current, if we just sort of have this free for all, throw it all in, and hope that it sort of creates a masterpiece at the end, you're likely to get a painting that's more like what I did at kindy at 3 years old. So we've got to have that planning. We've got to have a bit more structure around it to enable ourselves to not only have population growth, but also to reduce inequality and correct for some of those issues that both Graeme and Holly were talking about.
So just very briefly before we finish up, we have an interesting question come in. I don't think we'll be able to perhaps give it its due, but Claire has asked, are we automatically assuming that population growth is a good thing and that it is inevitable? You could, she's explained that, maybe we should just focus on taking care of the population that's already here, and that, I won't read out the whole question, it's a bit long, but the gist is basically, are we assuming that constant growth is possible and desirable? So Holly, I'll kick that to you to start with. What do you think?
I'll just say one thing that occurs to me in the context of climate change, which, so both other speakers have mentioned during the webinar, that there is really a possibility that New Zealand will begin to see increasing numbers of migrants wanting to move here in the future for reasons of climate displacement. And it's a policy conversation we're yet to really have as a country, but I think we do need to think about what's our moral obligation in that sense. And so I do think, just with that hat alone on, we should be expecting to see some population growth in the future. As to the broader question, I mean, I think the important thing is to plan for the most likely scenario. Some growth is obviously going to occur. There's a strong case, I think, to sort of stabilize that growth and have it not happen in a extremely steep way that's unmanageable. But it has to be, I guess what I'd say is, I think it has to be managed in the context of the international context and what our responsibilities are as an international citizen as well.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, I think we're nearly out of time. I know many of our viewers want to tune into the 1 p.m. update, so we will leave you there. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope this was a chance to get out of the present moment a little bit and think about some other things. Thank you to Graeme, Holly and Brad for your time. Really, really appreciate it. And we will be making a recording of this session available on YouTube, on the Helen Clark Foundation YouTube page. And you can also watch the session on our Facebook page because this has been live streamed. So if you've missed anything or you'd like to recap, please feel free to check out those recordings. So thank you so much, and all the best.